What's up YouTube, Redbeard's Garage, and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be putting a billet rod, a billet flywheel, and a Mod 2 cam in a Predator 212. We're going to start off by pulling the Makuni off of this engine with the two Allen head bolts. If you're running a stock carburetor, then it'll be two 10mm nuts. Now we can remove the four 8mm bolts holding the valve cover to the head. We need to remove the outside C-clips holding the rocker pins to the head by using the pick to pop them off. Be careful because these things can go flying across the room. Slide the pin inward to remove the valve rocker. Now you can pull out the push rods. To remove the flywheel cover, there's four 8mm bolts on each corner. There will be two 8mm bolts holding the coil pack to the block. There will be four 12mm bolts holding the head to the block. Now I'm going to remove the two 8mm bolts from the heat shield on the bottom of the head. This will allow for easier removal of the head. Now we can simply pull outward on the head and it'll come off freely. I'll be using a new head gasket, so we're going to have to remove this old leftover residue from the old head gasket. Now we go on to draining the oil with a 10mm drain plug. You can see that I've drilled a 1-inch hole in my workbench to allow for easier flywheel removals. Remove the flywheel nut holding the flywheel fan to the crankshaft. I'm going to place the flywheel nut back onto the crankshaft and place a pry bar under the flywheel. Then we can hit that flywheel nut while pressing down on the pry bar to release the flywheel from the crankshaft. Should be able to lift the flywheel off freely now. Next we have 6 10mm bolts holding the crankcase cover to the block. We can now remove the cam by simply pulling outward on them. I'm using a 10mm wrench to remove the 2 rod cap bolts. Remove the 2 cam tappets from the block. You can now push up on the rod, sliding the piston free from the block. With the piston and rod removed, we can now pull out the crankshaft, and now we have an empty block.
This is a Chucky Beat production.
In this build, we're going to be installing an ARC billet rod and also an ARC billet flywheel, as well as a Mod2 cam from Go Power Sports. The billet rod is going to allow our engine to handle anything we throw at it. The Mod2 cam will allow for more power in the higher RPMs. This billet flywheel will protect us in higher RPMs and has less drag due to the lower number of cooling fins. We'll also be using a Go Power Sports header that we've wrapped with some header wrap, as well as an RLV muffler. We reached out to Mr. Valve Cover, and they sent us a custom engraved valve cover that's going to complement the overall looks of this engine. Now if you look in the bottom of our block, you'll see why it's important to break your engines in and do an oil change in the first 5 to 10 hours. This is leftover casting sand and particles. These are in 90% of engines. They can destroy bearings in time if not removed. Now I'm using a razor blade to remove the leftover parts of the head gasket. There's 2 ways to go about checking oil clearances on your new ARC billet rod. One, you can use a caliper like I'm doing here to check the clearances, and the card that comes with the rod will tell you what the clearances should be. Now when you are checking your crankshaft with a caliper, you want to do it in several spots to make sure you're getting an overall good reading. The reason you want to check your oil clearance is because you want to make sure oil can get in there and do its job and lube that bearing. If you have a stuck bearing, it's going to break, then you can sling a rod. I've always used a caliper because it's a lot quicker and you're going to get about the same reading, but you can use plastic gauge. Here's a picture of it. You can buy it at any part store. And basically what you do is stick a piece of plastic gauge on the crankshaft journal, and then you can put the bearings in the rod and put the rod in a vise, wrapping it in a glove or an old shirt so you won't damage the rod. Then you can set the crankshaft down onto the rod, torque it all down to spec, and then take it all back apart, and you can see how wide that plastic gauge spread apart. It comes with a chart that you can check it with to make sure you are in clearance. Now we can remove the circlip from the wrist pin and remove the piston from the original rod. Just use a pick and pry out on the open end of the clip, and you'll be able to slide the wrist pin out of the piston. We need to slide the new rod bearing onto our billet rod. There are notches on the bearing as well as on the rod, so there's only one way to install these bearings. You'll notice the two dots on the piston rod and cap. This is where you won't install the rod cap backwards on the rod. Now we're going to need to seat the bearings by wrapping our billet rod in a glove and placing it in a vise. Be careful not to damage the rod. We can place the crank onto the rod and torque it down to spec. First, I dip my rod bolts in some oil because you don't want to dry torque them. I'm going to start off by torquing the bolts to 20 inch-pounds and working my way up 20 inch-pounds at a time while switching between the bolts until I end up with the overall 170 inch-pounds. When installing a Mod 2 cam on a Hemi engine, you're going to have to grind down the casting ears on the crankshaft. I place my crankshaft in a vise and I use masking tape to protect the crank journal. You can use a Dremel and grind down the ears so the cam lobes will clear the crank. This is only for the Hemi Predator engines. When you're installing the piston onto the ARC rod, you'll notice there's an arrow on the piston pointing down. That needs to go pointing down in the engine. And when you put the ARC billet rod on, you want the dipstick pointing down as well. So arrow on the piston pointing down as well as the dipstick. Now the oil dipper is going to push oil inside the bearings and make sure nothing goes dry. Now that we have our bearings seated onto the rod and cap, we can install the piston back into the block. You'll need a ring compressor to install the piston. Make sure your piston ring gaps are clocked 180 degrees apart. Oil the ring compressor, place it onto the piston so it compresses the ring. Let the piston skirts hang out of the compressor. Place the rod and piston into the block and tap lightly with the wood handle of a hammer. Now we can repeat the torque process that we used to seat the bearings and torque this rod back onto the crank. We use a 1/4 inch 12-point socket to install the rod bolts. Make sure you dip them in oil before installing them. You're going to need a 1/4 inch torque wrench. Now we can oil and install our cam tappets back into the block. When installing our cam, line the dots up on the cam and the crankshaft and slide the cam in. These dots are to make sure you have the engine in timing. can now put the side cover back onto the engine and torque the bolts down to 17 foot-pounds. Now we move on to installing the dowel pins in the head and the head gasket onto the block. We can now install our head and torque the four 12mm bolts down to 17 foot-pounds. Now we need to lap the crank. We'll use valve grinding compound to do this. Take the grinding compound and put it around the crankshaft end, and now we can put our flywheel on, turn it back and forth to make sure we have the perfect bonding surface between the two. Once properly lapped, make sure to clean all the compound off both the flywheel and the crank. I use a Q-tip to clean out the keyway to make sure there's nothing left over. We can now install the original key back into the crankshaft. Seat the flywheel onto the crankshaft and install the pull start bell and nut. The flywheel nut is to be torqued down at 54 pounds. Slide your push rods back into the head, seating them onto the cam tappets. Now we can install the valve rocker and retaining pins into the head. I'm using the same pick to pop the C-clips back onto those retaining pins. Install the coil back on with two 8mm bolts. Now we can set the coil gap with a .03 feeler gauge and tighten it all down. Run a ground wire for the coil back to its original spot and install the spark plug boot. Now I'm going to install the heat shield back onto the bottom of the head with the two 8mm bolts. Now I'm going to be installing the fan shroud that I have custom splatter painted with the four 8mm bolts as well. The valve cover from Mr. Valve Cover complements the flywheel shroud perfectly. Next is the VM22 Makuni, which is mounted to the engine with 2 Allen head bolts. Redbeard's Garage is powered by GoPowersports.com. GoPowersports has a huge amount of awesome go-kart and mini bike parts, and when making your purchase, use the Redbeard discount code in the upper right-hand corner of your shopping cart to grab yourself a sweet deal. Help support our channel with some merch by going to rbgcarts.com. We have shirts, stickers, and hats, and we're adding new designs all the time. Hit that subscribe button and make sure the notification bell is on so you'll never miss another episode, and go check us out on Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, and Pinterest to stay up to date with the channel. Guys, always come back to Redbeard's Garage. I'm out.